Great, we're live. Everybody, thank you so much for being here. This is the fifth Sunday that we're doing this Lenten session with the Desert Elders, Lent with the Desert Elders. And I wanted to do this because I wanted to bring elements from my book, which is The Way of the Desert Elders. I wanted to bring that into conversation with the 6 themes of Lent, traditional 6 themes. And I have to say that these 6 themes aren't ones that I had been familiar with up close and personal like I have been in these last few weeks. But I'm hoping to do this to make it a season that's more rich and meaningful, that draws us closer to God and closer to each other. And so each session, each week, I have a different co-host I picked for their uniqueness, and nobody's the same as the next one. And this is self-examination, the theme of this week, which is can be a fraught topic for some of us, and maybe people who have baggage with expectations over Lent, the Lenten time, or some people are completely unfamiliar with Lent. And so this will be a time to kind of encounter that topic. And I want to mention, you don't have to buy the book to be part of this session to understand what's happening. But of course, I would love if you buy the book, and I would love if you give a review. And I think that's all I was going to say. I have some notes here, but the next week is the final session, and that will be on conversion and what does that mean and what can that mean for us. But today I welcome Micah Morgan, pastor and therapist. Thank you so much, Micah, for being here.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
I particularly appreciate how you and your ministry and what I've seen of you and read and the posts that I watch and the sermons that I watch of you, that you pay special attention to the care of the soul and spiritual formation, and you have such a sensitivity for people who are looking to heal. I deeply appreciate that, and that's an aspect I was hoping could come into play here, that doesn't exactly overlap with my expertise and experience, because you're a pastor and I'm a writer, and those are different roles and different things. But with this topic, before we get even jumping into it, I would love to have you introduce yourself to those watching and talk a little bit about who you are and what you do in the world and what your passions are.
Yeah, thank you. I am in Central Ohio, so in Columbus, Ohio, and I'm serving my community right now as a full-time mental health therapist at a children's hospital, and also as a part-time associate pastor at Sanctuary Columbus Church. And my areas of specialty kind of range from supporting people who have a trauma history, who are working with mood disorders when it comes to my clinical and therapeutic work. I do a lot of couples as well. I also provide treatment to teens. But then on the spiritual side, I'm very sensitive to making sure that people are more acclimated to the love of God than the wrath of God. I think that Western Christianity has become a little too fixated on God's anger, and we have internalized that in unhealthy ways. And so I am very passionate about creating a collaborative spirituality where someone can be in relationship with God and know that they are loved, and have that be the platform for growth rather than having shame and just God's anger as a platform for growth.
And that's kind of your kindred spirit, your kindred spirit in that fact. I really see that in your work, and such a need too, because we've been conditioned, I think, to think out of this. Part of my work too is to try to reframe spiritual formation in the sense of preventative medicine, instead of a shame spiral of like, you're a dirty worm who, God should be sending to hell. And it's just these disconnecting, destabilizing ways to what draws into love. I don't, to me, it's a disconnect, and it shows up in how people wind up treating each other and being wrathful, being unloving and being wrathful, and worshiping a God who is like that. And we see it just all over. We see it with misguided Christians. Maybe they think they're doing the right thing in order to like whip people into shape, but it is really, in my own experience as well, it is really hard to feel connected to God when you feel hateful of yourself, self-loathing, you feel any of that, it's such a stumbling block and a stunting that happens. And since I'm coming from a spiritual formation perspective, I guess you could say, I just don't see how it's ever been beneficial to sort of, I don't know if it even is, it's nonsense to shame someone into positive transformation. I mean, you can scare them pretty good for a little while. I just don't think it takes root. And so I'm just so happy you are in the world, and people like you, and trying to do this different kind of work that draws people in to embrace, and not into, some kind of distance, or some kind of like, well, you have to get here before God's gonna love you, or we're gonna love you. And so I have some experience with your church, seeing it in person, going to Columbus at your invitation, at the pastor's invitation too, and you exposed him to my work, I believe is how it went down. And I was just so blessed and privileged to come by in those two different times that I spent with you all from your church. It is just it's a little gem in my in my memory of being able to connect with you guys in that way. And I know no church is perfect, and there are issues, but what was really a joy to my soul is to see the level of diversity of people, and the loving um, way that people treat each other. And it's just such a blessing. That was a couple of years ago now, but it definitely is very fresh in my mind.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am honored and humbled that you experienced us that way, but
Mhm.
I really have to say your book, your teaching, and I actually have it here because this is what we based our sermon series off of when you came to join us one of those times, The Wild Land Within.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just this invitation to really befriend and get curious about our internal world is right
Mhm.
in line with the thing we're committed to as a community. So
Mhm.
I still have folks telling me about the things that they read in your book. I still
Oh,
have
wow.
members who are still reading your book. And so, yeah, thank you for saying yes to
Um,
spending time with us.
oh yeah, easiest yes ever. Totally. But yeah, my book was really centered on looking at the inner world. And it's funny, I've run across in the time since, of people speaking, not directly at my work, but just saying, oh, the inner life is, that's new age, or what's the other one, like empathy is a sin, and like all this like weird ridiculous stuff. I'm like, I don't know, Jesus is talking about the four soils. That's not outside in the yard. That's inside. That's an
Agreed.
inside job. So I don't think it differs from what Jesus was getting after with examining and pulling out the weeds, and doing the things we have to do to heal and grow and be honest. And um, so I deeply appreciate that's been an influence on your community. It really is um, an honor to be trying to cooperate with God in that whole that whole endeavor. And it was Evagrius in that book that drew me into this greater community of desert elders, which I was like, hold on. Evagrius had a spiritual mother who told him, tried to kick his butt into gear. I like that. Who's this lady? Who's this community of people? Like he
Yes.
has a spiritual mom. He has an amma, and he obeys her. He obeys
Mm.
her guidance and advice, and we wouldn't have so many writings, and the era would have been very different without him. So I was so excited to bring these ancient forebears, these inspirational figures back into conversation. And it's been really fun to see how these stories have landed with people. And I'll be curious to see like what things landed for you a little later on, after we kind of get through our topic, which is a topic, again, self-examination is not a, oh yay, I can't wait to examine because I'm going to find only good things. No, you're not. And so self-examination, and I do think we should be trying to find good things as well, not just like, just keep it negative or something like that. So I did want to bring about the idea too that there's self-examination that could be fruitful, and then there's self-examination
Mhm.
that could probably be damaging. And from your point of view as a therapist, I wanted to dig into that a little bit. And I would first like to say, ask you this question and be in conversation with you with this whole thing in mind about not wanting to disconnect from God as we grow. In your
Mm.
opinion, what do you think is the purpose of a time during Lent prior to Easter of doing something like self-examination? What do you think is that point from your perspective?
Yeah, I first off didn't grow up with Lent being a huge part of my spiritual formation. I grew up in the Black Baptist church and we
Mhm,
had many spiritual practices, but Lent wasn't like
mhm,
necessarily one of them. We did fasting, and as I got older, um, but as I've gotten to know the Lenten season better, I have come to really appreciate it as a time to reorient ourselves to who God is and who we
mhm,
are as humans. And really, that means a number of beautiful things that it takes a
mhm,
whole lifetime to discover. But
mhm,
one of them is that God is the ultimate goodness and beauty and ultimate creativity in the universe.
mhm,
And we as humans are frail and reliant upon God. And that
mhm,
doesn't make us inherently bad, but it helps us to understand our position in relation to God
mhm,
as as beings who can faithfully rely on a faithful God.
mhm,
And what I love about Lent now in this part of my life that I didn't have growing up is that
mhm,
now it's not a shame-filled season. It's
mhm,
not kind of like you jokingly said before, like, "We're worms and I don't deserve anything in life," but it's like
mhm,
this beautiful picture of God as a gardener
mhm,
just setting their hands into the soil of our lives and
mhm.
inviting us to sit next to God as
Yeah.
God is tilling the soil. And so
Mhm,
I imagine God pointing at little elements of the soil and saying, "You see that? Yeah, we're gonna pull that and we're gonna nurture
mhm,
this. We're gonna move this over here." It's a beautiful partnership where we're
mhm,
in relationship with one another, shaping our lives in Christ likeness.
mhm,
And so that is a very helpful period before we get to celebrating what Jesus accomplished in the
mhm.
resurrection, because I think in order to fully understand the resurrection, we need to fully understand ourselves in relation to God. And so that's why I really appreciate the Lenten season.
Oh, that's so well said. I'm I'm also reminded as you speak of it in these terms, how Lent is started with Ash Wednesday. First, there's the party. There's a Fat Tuesday. You know, people eat donuts
Mhm,
sometimes. People go crazy on Mardi Gras down in New Orleans. But there's Ash Wednesday, and you're supposed to remember that you're dust, that you are
mhm,
not worthless dust, but you will perish from this earth in a physical form. You will go back to the earth, back to another part of God's creation. But that being acquainted with, in humility, being acquainted with I am frail and vulnerable. I'm mortal. I'm not what my ego might tell me is I'm amazing, or the reverse of like I'm nothing, you know. But
mhm,
this whole idea of just getting acquainted with our humanity and our frailty in a way that we know we really need God. We really need to be dependent on God. We really need God to work in our hearts, as you're saying, tilling the soil and maybe pulling rocks out first and getting the fertilizer in there and allowing this sort of special time. And totally agree with what you're saying about this preparation before Easter to really understand the power of the resurrection, the power of God renewed in our lives in this regeneration that happens. If you don't do any of the work first, you know, the planting and the harrowing of the soil, then to reap a harvest, it's not going to be the same kind of harvest than if you actually put in some time. And
mhm,
and so framing it in that light of Lent being preparation, not a time to beat yourself up or like, oh, I didn't do enough, or I didn't uh, withhold enough from myself, or I didn't fast enough, or whatever the thing is, but just that God, even if the only thing we'd ever did in Lent was just pray, God, prepare the soil of my heart for a
mm,
harvest of resurrection. Just prepare it. I don't know what that means or what that looks like or what you want to tell me or what you want me to sink deeply into. But even if
Mm,
we had Lent to just do that, is so much better than just going through haphazardly and like, what season is it? Who cares? I don't know what's going on. And then, oh, it's Easter. That there is this 40 days that's supposed to be a kind of trial or a kind of preparation. And we have Advent for that too. And as I've grown, same as you, I grew up with a Baptist pastor father for a
mm,
time. No idea about Lent or the season or anything. But as I've realized what the Christian calendar offers us to spiral, like you hit the same things again, but not in a circle, more like a spiral, and it hits
mm,
differently each season, each year, but coming around to the same themes again and again drills you down deeper into really interesting ways of learning and really interesting spiritual formation. So the lectionary that some people use for their sermons, it can be
mm.
really helpful. It can be really and knowing that Christians all over the world are following the lectionary of the certain themes throughout the year, it really is interesting. And this is where we can sink more deeply into Christian tradition beyond the Protestant Reformation, beyond some of that, some of these earlier times. So I love what you've said there. I wanted to also ask, just from your personal experience, if you have practices of self-examination in your life now, or have you had ones that have been fruitful for you?
Yeah, I one of my favorite right now is gospel meditation. I first got introduced to it as a spiritual practice in David Benner's book, The Gift of Being Yourself. And but I've heard that it's got some Ignatian, kind of
Mhm,
connections as well as a practice.
mhm,
But really what it involves is that moment in the Gospels where Jesus is the main character, um, and imagining in a really sensory kind of way.
mhm,
So going as far as imagining the tone of Jesus's voice, imagining
mm,
uh, the ways that the people in the audience responded to Jesus, the feelings that they felt as they heard Jesus speak, what they felt and did as they walked away from that moment with Jesus, and meditating on those moments. And then asking myself the question, now that I have spent this time soaking in Jesus's presence, what do I know more deeply about Jesus? What's
mm,
important to Jesus? And what am I being invited into in terms of Christ likeness for myself, based on
mm,
either Jesus's example or Jesus's explicit teaching in that moment? And that is really one of the practices that I come back to
mm,
over and over and over again. And it
mm,
really roots me in a more experiential relationship with Jesus, so
mhm.
that I am formed, my behavior is formed, my feelings, my beliefs, and not just my thoughts or ideas about Jesus. And so that's been a really core practice for me the last several years.
I love that you mentioned that. That is very Ignatian. Yes, and you're kind of talking like a spiritual director about inviting. What is God inviting? That's what my spiritual director was always speaking of. And it is what you're saying is such an excellent point in terms of like sometimes we do Bible study, right? But it's sort of feeding our thoughts.
Mhm.
And sometimes it stops at it doesn't get embodied necessarily. It might be accumulated knowledge, which is fun. I'm a nerd. I love that stuff. But is it really changing us? Is it changing
Mm,
us with each other? Is it changing us that you feel closer to God and you sense God's presence more? I would argue that if it Bible study isn't doing that, it's sort of it's sort of just a not a game, but like it's just a kind of exercise. Like, but it isn't really necessarily moving toward something that could really be a harvest. Like we're speaking of this harvest, but that idea of taking a parable or taking a portion of the Gospels where Jesus is interacting with disciples, or the one that really was transformative to me was when my director talked about Jesus in the boat in the storm. He's taking a nap,
mm,
and in reading it and like, okay, feel the salt feel the salt in the air, feel the splash of the water, feel the wind. And are you scared? What are you doing? Are you hanging out with the disciples? And for whatever reason, in the moment that I said this in the first time I explored this kind of meditation on the Gospels and the stories of Jesus, making them real to me in a new way. I just
Mm.
thought, no, I'm napping right alongside Jesus. We're spoons. We're spoons. And I want to be comforted by Jesus. I'm not
Love
worried
it.
about the storm. If he's sleeping, I'll be okay too. And I remember
Mm.
thinking, in a way, surprising myself with that thought, but that's what I felt like in the moment. And of course, it could be different depending on where you're at and what you're experiencing in your life. And there's not like some wrong answer, but you can identify with different people in the story each time you read it, and or you're just kind of witnessing it as but there is something that changes you because we get to use our holy imagination, and God can enter into our lives through these, in a sense, these art forms of storytelling. And in a way it helps. There's something else going on when
Yeah.
stories are, when you put yourself in the story like that. And I would say even like historical pieces that you're that you're reading too, like what would you be doing in this or that instance. And then it can take on such a personal thing. It's not just a story that you accumulate in your mind and in your repertoire of stories about Jesus, but that it's like a story that has changed you, and you thought this way and now you think this way. So that's a really great thing for anybody listening now and live or in the replay. I hope that you can encounter that. I know there's devotional books to that effect, but if you just open your Bible to one of the stories in the gospel and take 5 or 10 minutes to read it slowly a few times, and you could pick out someone there. What would it be like to be them? What would it be
Mhm.
like to be listening to Jesus? And just immerse yourself in a new way. That is an excellent way of, and even moving toward our ideas of self-examination. What does that ask of me? What what's the barrier, if there's a barrier? What's happening internally? Just kind of opening our senses, but this deeper way of knowing.
Yeah.
So that is just really great. Nobody has said that yet in my co-hosting. We're a new ground here. So this is really a beautiful example and a beautiful suggestion for anybody who wants to encounter devotional life a little differently.
Mhm.
Very good. And do you ever wind up introducing that to other people or drawing people into those types of things, or has that been more personal?
Oh, absolutely. Whoever will trust me with inviting them into that with me, I am
Mhm.
absolutely inviting people to waste time with Jesus with me in the Gospels.
Yeah.
I'm kind of in this place right now in my faith where, I'm not a full-on Paul basher, but I'm just like, I am accepting of the fact that Paul was very much a man of his time,
Mhm.
and he was a man and therefore
Right.
limited culturally and socially in the ways that he was
Mhm.
able to pastor. And
Yeah.
so I am in the last, like, 9 months, I've just been like, if I'm doing Bible study or meditation, I'm going for words explicitly from Jesus, moments
Yes.
explicitly with Jesus first,
Yes.
and then I'll let the epistles supplement.
I hear
And
you.
yeah.
Yeah. And someone brought up this point. I think this is a very salient point. Jesus is a peasant, no real education whatsoever, um, Galilean, not in these upper echelons of Pharisees.
Mhm.
Paul, top of his game, wealthy enough to afford to buy his Roman citizenship.
Yep.
They are really in different social classes,
Mhm.
and it shows.
Yep.
And it shows. And that's okay, but, like,
Yeah.
let's be honest about it. They're from different walks of life,
Uh-huh.
and some of the stuff he's saying is, I think, out of privilege.
Mhm.
I think he's saying it out of privilege, and we can call that out when we see it.
Yeah.
And Jesus was at the absolute bottom rung, and I think that's why he reached out to women like he did.
Mhm.
He knows what it's like to be the outcast, or look like his mom was doing stuff she shouldn't have been doing, and he's paying
Uh-huh.
for that socially, and all the embarrassment that must have caused in their tiny little town. And he totally gets the outcast, the marginalized. And so his stuff is straight up in there. So I love that. And not to drag Paul, but we will, you see people following Paul more than they will follow Jesus. And I'm
Yeah.
like, maybe we got to pump those brakes on that one.
Yeah. We got to do some correction when it comes to
Mhm.
Western Christianity for sure.
Yeah. Where you're going to place authority is
Hmm.
Jesus's words and Paul's words. And I think they actually go together quite well, but we do have to realize who's saying what, I think sometimes.
Hmm.
Um, so I wanted to also encounter this aspect that I touched on a little bit already, which is, what do you recommend for people who end up doing self-examination? They know they want to do it, they know they should do it, but it ends up turning into condemnation, self-condemnation, or a disconnection. Like, for people who wind up struggling with some of that, just, there are people who are going to really need it and that's going to do the work just right. And then there are other people who are going to just kind of sink into maybe a bad place or a dark place or unhelpful place. Do you have any kind of, from your vantage point as a therapist, as a pastor, like, what are some of the things you can elucidate toward that?
Yeah. Well, I think the most essential part of a healthy faith is understanding that everything that God does is motivated by love, and not in this very kind of, dismissive, like just abstract kind of way,
Mhm.
but this very deeply experiential reality that God is committed to the wholeness of all creation, and the
Mhm.
motivation to keep God's creation whole
Mhm.
is the love that motivates all of God's action. And I think wholeness is so important to that definition as well, because
Mhm.
sometimes we look at the practice of self-examination and we think it is just the practice of fixing problems with ourselves. And maybe, but I don't think that's very productive in and of itself. I
Mhm.
think it's more productive to see ourselves as a part of a huge puzzle that
Mhm.
God lovingly put together in Genesis chapter 1, and that a part of the problem that God is trying to fix is not just humans being broken, but that whole puzzle is disconnected. The
Mhm.
relationship between humans and God is disconnected. The relationship between human and human is disconnected. The relationship between oneself is
Mhm.
disconnected. And the relationship between humanity and non-human creation. So,
Mhm.
the environment, the vegetation around us, that relationship is disconnected.
Mhm.
And so any self-examination that we do is us asking the question, how do I healthily meet my needs so that I am participating in this grand puzzle that God has created in a healthy way?
Mhm.
How do I make sure I am taking good care of my soul in partnership with the Holy Spirit, so that when I interact with the other parts of the puzzle,
Mhm.
I'm doing it in a way that nurtures it and leads to its flourishing? And so I think if that is the motive of self-examination, then shame doesn't win. Now that's a very practical, it's a very empowering picture
Yeah.
of what we're up to when we look inside of ourselves and say, Lord, search me and change me so that I can look more like Christ.
Mhm. Ooh, that's a sermon. That's why you're a pastor. That's why you do what you do. Oh, what you're speaking of is context,
Mhm.
this contextualized self-examination that is about the reconciliation of all things to
Yeah.
God
Yes.
and to each other, this dynamic network we have between us, amongst us, and
Mhm.
within. And that reframing is a whole different ballgame. Then we're doing something totally different than my personalized, individualized pick, pick, pick. We're not
Yeah.
talking about that. We're not talking about picking away, nitpicking about what you don't like about yourself. We're talking about the broader context of what God is up to recreate the world into reconciliation and harmony and big things. We don't have time for your petty shame of your individual self. Like that's not for this.
Nope.
That can be dismissed because it isn't useful. It's not helpful. It's not going to go anywhere good. And so this, yeah, wow. If we start there, that's a new. You're telling me something that I have nibbled around the edges of, but not really grabbed hold of with two hands. That you just served up the dish for me to grab with two hands. And I love that starting point of self-examination, making sure that where we're coming from is this bigger idea, and then moving from there so that you won't even get to that point of I'm a bad person. There's so many things wrong with me. What am I going to do? Even though we all do need healing and we've got baggage and we got to work on it, but thinking of the broader, I could meditate on that. I'm going to keep that one and I'm going to meditate on that for the next few days, probably. That is really, really just spot on, just absolutely spot on. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you.
Whew. I guess the next question I have is, from what you've read in the book, and I don't know that you've finished the book at all yet. I know you've dug in a bit, but what do you think the Desert Elders teach us about this process of self-examination? Do you think they mostly got it right? They mostly got it wrong? Do they have any kind of wisdom for us in terms of what we can do about this topic?
1000% yes. And so I'm actually really grateful, Lisa, that you wrote this second book, because when I read The Wild Land Within, I became more curious about the Desert Elders, but I have to admit, I felt myself being skeptical that the fullness of their spiritual life could have been enacted in such like an isolated kind of life. But the more that I read the Way of the Desert Elders, really helped to understand how much they existed in community. That I think in the West, when we hear the word monastic, we think isolated and, withdrawn. And yes, there were elements of spending large periods of time in one's cell, for example, looking within and asking the question, what do I need to do in the tilling of my soil? But, like you said, Evagrius had, his Amma that was inviting him into deeper formation constantly. And the elders lived in, their area out in the desert, but also spent time in community, going back into community to serve. And so that was very enlightening for me and comforting because I have this very communal view of spirituality. But to answer your question, what I love about the Desert Elders is that they really model contemplative spirituality in a practical way. And it's this invitation to constantly ask, not what is wrong with me, but where are the gaps? Where are the parts in my internal world where I'm meeting my needs in inappropriate ways? So for example, with vainglory, we think of seeking out affirmation and glory from others as just arrogance. But really, it's the maladaptive meeting of the core need that we all have, which is affirmation and belonging and significance. And so the question is, it's not, is it okay to want to be seen? But it's in what ways is it healthy to be seen? And the answer to that question is in service or in healthy relationship with other people. Those are healthy ways to be seen, not at the expense of or in the exploitation of other people. And so that's one example of why I love getting into this kind of spirituality, is because it's so accessible. The questions that they were asking themselves out in the desert, we can still ask ourselves today.
That's great. Yeah, there's for those of you just watching it, you don't know what the book's about. There are virtues and vices in each chapter that are explored, and they're common to all of us. They're not just things that happened in yesteryear. They happen to you if you're human. But instead of seeing them as deadly sins and moral failings, the desert elders were very preventive medicine. Like, yeah, it's coming. Like this temptation's coming because you're a human being, and that's what's going to happen. Like you're saying about vainglory, for instance, is kind of the show off thing. It's kind of like, hey, I'm doing this good thing, and it's more of like something that a good person might do, like because you don't necessarily get a social reward for doing something good. So maybe if you tell everybody, maybe you'll feel a little gratified. And the whole idea is that not that um, like you said, not that we can't be seen or that people know what we're doing, that we have to hide every single good thing we do, but the idea of that is going to kind of be the thing that fills you up, is that so
Mhm.
then you're just kind of hanging on. Do people like me? Are they approving of me? And you're kind of looking around to see, is this helping me out? Is this working for me? Is this getting my street cred up or something in these righteous ways? But but it takes something. So the vice has the virtue
Mhm.
that's connected with it, and you can work with it, but not in a, well, you screwed up again. It's just like, okay, this happened. Here's something you can do. You can kind of prevent this, or if you sense that things have gone awry, just turn around and stop doing it and repent. I like that they're what happened in these desert communities would you would be mentored by someone who was wise, someone who was older and further along on the spiritual path. So you weren't going solo. It was not an individual project. And even hermits who would go out decades after being in community, they would go out to be hermits. They would still come back
Mhm.
and worship on Sunday. They would still come back and give a word to the younger ones, and people could ask them questions. It was a back and forth conversation. It was very, very mentorship, discipleship focused. You're a
Mhm.
student and you're learning, and you're always a student and you're always learning. Even though they called the mothers and fathers Abbas and Almas as a term of respect, they were actually all brothers and sisters on total equal footing. So it very very much is community related, and I think I thought of it the same way too. I thought, oh, hermits, yeah, they're just out there for years, and they're these wise pious people, and it's like, well, they took supplies to them. They couldn't just live out there. They took supplies, they got prayed with, they asked for wisdom, and then they
Yeah.
sometimes took on students, and it wasn't any kind of individual project. It was all essentially community based, and the community is what helped people transform. It wasn't going to happen in some solo
Mhm.
project. and
Yeah.
I think we live in such, our mentality in the West tends to be so individualized that we would just assume that's how it is. They're running off to the desert doing the little hermitage thing
Mhm.
and not realizing they're completely connected to others.
Yep.
And so I think that is something also that I was the research I did for the book. I was like, okay, they are praying for the church, and the church is praying for them,
Mhm.
and it really is how it worked. And I think maybe in uh, the era that we're in, where you could just get Amazon Prime kind of dropped off at your door, whatever your needs may be, we tend to think that people can kind of exist like that. And it's only been extremely recently that you can just kind of do your little project. And I don't think it's good for us, but it is, what can happen. So.
Yeah, and I actually really like the way, Lisa, to your point, that you defined spiritual maturity in the book, on page 198, where you said the real test of spiritual maturity isn't whether it works on an isolated mountaintop cabin or a refreshing retreat center. It's
Mhm.
whether we have been transformed so that our maturity plays out in regular life.
Mhm.
And I think that's such a helpful definition. It's
Yeah.
not how pious and self-righteous we look when we're at the retreat center for, whatever workshop we're doing. It's
Mhm.
it's how patient we're able to be with our coworker because we have spent time meditating alongside of Jesus in moments where he was patient in the gospels. Like
Right.
that is a true test of spiritual maturity. And that's what the Abbas and Ammas were practicing in
Mhm.
community. They weren't just retreating and being with themselves. They were making sure that their
Mhm.
spirituality worked itself out in real life.
Exactly. And I like to think is the people who annoy you are actually helping you form spiritually,
Yes.
right? Because it's not going to happen in this great circumstance. It's going to
Nope.
be that those rough edges that get worn off of us, and it's not
Mhm.
always pleasant. But we have a lot of wisdom from, like, the Amish, for instance. Some of their wisdom is coming from these direct problems that they're saying,
Mhm.
because you will hear, I hear it now too. Oh, we should have a commune and we should go off the grid and we should be on our own. Or I wish I could just go off and retreat to the desert. No, you do not.
No. No, 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 no.
Because it's going to be way harder than you think. The demons are coming out then. But also, it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't work amongst others.
Mhm.
It isn't practiced. It's just an idea of, like, of piety or something. It doesn't actually have value until it's tried, and we'll try and fail too. So I think a lot of these communities, they're not perfect. There's a lot of stuff coming up. They have to be coaxed to humility, because also they're also like, wow, I did a lot of fasting, and they could easily get a little excited about themselves, a little self-satisfied. I'm
Mhm.
doing really good with my prayers now, and the Amas and the Abbas would have all this wisdom, would be like, this is the direction you need to go in. And so I
Mhm.
think it's interesting. We're learning from their mistakes. We're not really learning from their successes. And that's kind of how we tend to learn too. Like, when
Yeah.
everything's going great, you're not really learning that much. You might be enjoying yourself for a little bit, but the lessons come usually from those struggles, times of struggle or times of abrasion against others, or some sort of other issue. And I think it's important to think of things practically when we're speaking about spiritual formation. If it's not going great, that's kind of normal. It's not
Yes.
going to be going great. Like, you're not going to be just hitting aces day after day. You're going to be messing up.
Yeah.
You're going to be getting in little conflicts with people, or little misunderstandings, or little issues, and
Mm.
then you're going to be moving through it. And that's the kind of mentality we have to assume, that um, just because just because you don't feel, I don't know, holy all the time or righteous all the time or all those things, that just means you're like everybody else, and you
Yeah.
have to take it. You have to take it one day at a time, one situation and one person at a time, and that's realistic and that's real life. And sometimes we put these ancient folks on a pedestal, not even a literal pedestal like the Stylites, but we put them on a pedestal of, like, well, they were way holier than us, and they were out there on their own, so they got to be holy like Jesus. And it's like, I don't know, like, it's
Mm-mm.
not quite so nice and clean story there where everything goes great. And I think that seeing their humanity, seeing the practical side of things, is really informative for us now, because we're not going to get it right.
Yeah. And I really appreciate the humanity that you brought to them in the book. I want to make sure I'm remembering, was it Abba Evagrius who grew up just really wealthy, but also very learned and got really ill all of a sudden?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And so reading his story really showed how someone who has experienced a lot of privilege, it gave me compassion for the way that he may have just been shaped to get his need for affirmation and significance met by
Mhm.
appearing really smart and appearing really wealthy and well dressed. And that
Right.
was just the way that he was nurtured into thinking, this is how I experience my significance in the world. And he had
Mhm.
to unlearn that. And that doesn't make him a terrible human. It makes him someone who was shaped by his context. And so
Mhm.
his particular journey of Christ likeness had to do with pruning out that vainglory, that pride, that
Yeah.
arrogance. And
Yeah.
so reading the stories that way, I loved that you went back and told us about what they were like before they went to the desert,
Yeah,
because
right, right.
that's the stuff that they were working through in the desert.
Yes, yes. And he was doing all kinds of like he was doing some pretty severe ascetic practices. I didn't include all the things that I found about him, but he did this one thing, and this didn't make it into the book. He like put himself down a well for a couple days, so he was like freezing cold and numb
Oh
because he
my.
really felt like I am just so interested in my appetites. I'm so
Mhm.
interested in the stuff that will not satisfy. And because he was used to the good life, he was used to
Mhm.
top, absolute top bishop in Constantinople, totally, totally impressive, totally, had all these winning arguments and was like, wow, he's so smart. But it really did go to his head, and he did have to unlearn all that
Mhm.
and just be acquainted with his humanity and his and I think that sickness broke him down so that he was kind of ready to listen to other ideas maybe of like
Mhm.
how stuff should go. And yeah, his story is just so interesting. And then some of his writings are just so he has a heart and an empathy for people who struggle with the things that he struggled with. This is why he knows about all the vices because
Yep.
he had them all. And he's like, and he has a compassion for them. He's not like,
Yeah.
figure it out. I figured it out. He's like, yeah, so this is coming. And
Mm.
then after this one, this might be coming along. And I've gone through it and you can go through it. And here's how you do it. He's actually hilarious when he goes into this. If you get a chance to read this, he kind of goes into this little spiel about the noonday demon. And I didn't include all of it in the book, but if you ever get a chance to read this, the noonday demon is acedia. And he would kind of, he said it in such a funny way. He's like, so the monks have a habit of kind of like, I'm bored. I'll just take a walk. I'm going to go through some books. And instead of praying in their cell and kind of being concentrating and devoted, he'd be like, oh, they just find all kinds of things to do. And he says it in the funniest way. He's kind of like, you're getting bored. I know. Now you want to run off to some other place and try some other adventure. But he
Mm.
was kind of calling them down into a more disciplined life, but also saying, I see what you're doing. I see that you're kind of like, what's other people doing right now? What else is going on around here? So he's just kind of calling them out on it and saying, this is going to bother you between, he literally figured it out. For those people, it's going to bother them from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's going to be
Wow.
this noonday demon. It's going to bother you at this time because you're going to be the most wanting some excitement and not wanting to kind of finish what you started for the day.
Mm.
He's just so wise, and he's so he just like psychologically, from the psychological point of view, he just gets it. And I
Yeah.
just was so blown away by his insights. And I continue to be every time I come across his material. So I hope
Mm.
people get interested in maybe digging in a little more to Evagrius and some of the things he spoke about. He is just an amazing spiritual father. And so he's the reason why I did the elder book in the first place, because he just led me to a bunch of other characters and figures from that time. But his writings themselves were just, I mean, they're kind of pastoral. They're kind of,
Mm.
spiritual fatherly, and it was just great. So I hope that everybody else falls in love with him as much as I did. I'm like I'm a fangirl, at this point. So um, I guess that was great to hear what you thought about the book in those ways. And um, this is probably a great time to wind it down, but I wanted to make sure that people know where they can find you. I've enjoyed your posts on Instagram very much that you've been doing, and
Thank
I
you.
watch your sermons. Sometimes a few of your sermons I've been watching when you do them. But if people want to find out a little bit more of what you're up to or where to, be interacting with the work you do, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I'm maybe more active on TikTok nowadays, at J. Marie Morgan, no periods or spaces or anything.
Mhm.
But on that platform, I'm really just creating a space to make mental health, faith, and justice doable for people. So I've got some conversations going on there. And then also on Instagram at micah.j.morgan. But those are really the two places that I love connecting with folks. And I really enjoy just good, wholesome conversations about faith and what it means to just be a real person living in this world.
Mm. We need some of that. We need the real grounded stuff that's not just pie in the sky, or not just like, let's be a good girl and a good boy, but like what's going to actually help us, and what's going to actually,
Exactly.
keep us in touch with our humanity and the humanity of other people in,
Mhm.
in, in grace and love towards ourselves and
Yeah.
towards each other. And so I love what you're doing with that. I'm not on TikTok. I do not want to go there. I just don't. I got to draw a line somewhere. And I flirted with the idea of like, after I'm done promoting this book for, I don't know, year, I don't know, to just be like, I'm so tempted to just be like, cancel everything. Cancel.
Ooh.
I don't know that it can happen, but honestly, I get sucked into, Evagrius would tell me, girl, get off the social media. You're doom scrolling again,
Mm.
or whatever. And I'll get wound up, and then I'll see like, hey, I just saw my phone told me you were on an average of 3 hours and 38 minutes a day. I was like, what? What are you talking about? That's not what happened at all. What a lie. Uh, I'd like to think you're counting when I was watching videos and putting my own videos up, because that seems pretty high. So like, I don't need any more of that.
I hear you.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know how you do it. So you said TikTok and Instagram are your main ones,
Yes,
right?
and to your point, honestly, Lisa, that's all I can handle. I'm not even on Instagram very often.
No.
But I had a similar journey of like I deleted my Twitter, I deleted my Facebook several years ago because I
Mm,
had just gotten so emotionally unhealthy and was
yes.
just comparing myself all the time, everyone that I saw. And I'm like, why am I comparing myself to these strangers? Like, and so I just went cold turkey and just deleted.
Whoa.
I had like
It's
maybe
gone.
4,000 Twitter followers and I was just like, that's it. I can't do it anymore. So
Wow.
this
That's
is actually recent for me. I got back
ooh,
on to social media, maybe like 2 years ago, like really on it. So
yeah.
you're not
I
alone.
know that if it weren't for Twitter, our paths probably wouldn't have connected.
I know we wouldn't have met.
Yeah, and I think for Twitter was pretty awesome for a while. It could
Yeah.
get weird. It could get weird. But I met a lot of writer friends,
Yeah.
people that I met, and then later in real life that I really, everybody that I met in real life was like 3 times as great as they were on Twitter.
Oh.
Of course, haven't gone on Twitter, and I don't even know how long, and I don't bother with it. Um,
Mm.
and I tried Blue Sky. I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do
Yeah,
that. I
I
mean, I
tried.
have a thing on there, but I'm like, I cannot. The thing that I kind of have done is Substack, and there's more conversations, but it's more like people sort of sign up for what you're doing to
Yeah.
follow you, and you follow them back. And so it's a little more goodwill. It can get, I mean, everything can get nasty sometimes. Like I think threads on Instagram I've seen go down some bad paths, um, but if it's not like generative conversation, it is so life sucking from me. And so I'm
Mhm.
trying to figure out, like, I rarely go on Facebook. That's just to me like a necessary evil for trying to promote what I'm doing. But I could, I don't want, mm-mm. Like if they asked for 25 cents a month to be on it, I'd be like, oh, I guess I'm done. Uh, that's not even worth that to me. And yet my stuff's on there, and I, like all these photos and whatever. Um, somebody, Maggie from my church said, thank you, really enjoyed today.
Hi,
Thanks, Maggie.
Maggie.
And, yeah, but social media is, I thought it would kind of wind down by now because it's been kind
Mm.
of a destructive influence. And,
Mhm.
and when you have like world leaders giving out their instructions via the post, it's
Ooh,
just, we're in a bizarre time.
yeah,
Like, I don't even think that should be allowed. I don't know why it is, but it's who was
agreed.
it who said this? Ryan Holiday, who's very much into stoicism, said, I've seen enough really smart people have their brains broken on social media to know that it's a really serious, dangerous problem or thing
Yeah.
that we're experiencing now,
Mhm.
that sometimes takes people and makes them really ugly and
Yeah.
really corrosive and destructive. And it's like, and people obviously have destroyed their careers through just different
Mhm.
mean posts and stuff. So, um, Yeah, all that to say, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but I know that I want to do something.
I gotcha.
So,
We'll see.
yeah, yeah. And if you ever want to get on Substack, you would know that that's a little bit of a like it's an upgrade from like some of the other options because it's much
Mm,
more like readerly and stuff like that. So,
yeah.
but do you have any parting wisdom for us or anything that you'd like to share before we leave as a kind of final thought?
Mm.
Let me surprise you with that.
Yeah. No, I think, for anyone listening or watching, I just want you to know that when God called you very good in Genesis chapter 1, God did not change their mind. And
Mm,
that love that God felt in that moment, God still feels for you now. And that love that God feels for you equips you to be an agent of goodness everywhere you go. And so I deeply, deeply want anyone watching this to know that.
mm. Wow, that's a word. Thank you, Micah. Brilliant. Just such a pleasure to connect with you now and to dialogue and converse like this. So I just want to express my thanks to anybody watching. I hope you watch this, watch the replay, share it. There's a lot of juicy nuggets in here, and I'm really grateful to you. Thank you so much, Micah.
Thank you, Lisa. This was great.
Next week, if you come back or you watch the replay, it will be the final one with Mark Longhurst, and it will be the topic of conversion, and we'll see how that goes. It should be an interesting one. So thank you everybody for participating or showing up or watching the replay. It's been great, and you can always go back to the ones you haven't seen and pick those up because there's some good ones in there. So, signing off. Bye bye.